Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. In the farthest reaches of the shadowed forest, Morgana's labored breaths echoed through the hollow trees, her once majestic figure reduced to a battered silhouette limping through the tangled undergrowth. The battle at Camelot was a disaster she hadn't anticipated. Her dark magic had faltered against Arthur's knights and Merlin's clever spells. She cursed them both, their names searing into her thoughts like molten iron. Her dark hair was matted with dirt, and her elegant robes were torn to shreds. It was the lowest she had ever been, but not the end. They thought they had won, foolish men. "I will return," she muttered under her breath, her voice hoarse and broken. "And when I do, Camelot will burn." The night pressed around her, thick and oppressive, but Morgana drew from it. Darkness was her companion now, the last thing she could trust. She could feel the stirrings of power within her, a faint flicker buried beneath the weight of defeat. It was weak now, but it wouldn't remain so. She would find a way to restore Ida to grow stronger than she had ever been before. Hours later, she collapsed by the banks of a blackened stream, its water tainted and foul. Morgana dipped her hands into it, ignoring the sting as it touched her wounds, and whispered the first of many incantations. Her magic was too feeble to heal her completely, but it was enough to keep her alive. She closed her eyes and sank into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of the past dreams of her once beloved Camelot. In her dreams, she saw the great halls, the banners fluttering in the breeze, and the faces of those who had betrayed her. Arthur, with his noble heart, always willing to forgive Merlin, with his insufferable wisdom, always a step ahead. She had loved them once, before the treachery, before the lies. But now, all she felt was a cold, burning rage. Far from the wilderness where Morgana hid, Camelot stood proud under the glow of the rising sun. King Arthur strode through the halls of the castle, his armor glinting in the light, the mantle of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. The victory over Morgana had been costly, and though she had fled, Arthur felt no peace. The kingdom might have celebrated, but he knew this reprieve was temporary. Morgana would return. She was nothing if not relentless. Merlin appeared at his side, the hem of his robe trailing along the polished stone floors. His eyes, sharp and wary, mirrored Arthur's unspoken thoughts. "You can feel it too," Merlin said softly. Arthur didn't need to ask what he meant. "She's not done with us." "We've won nothing." "Not yet," Merlin agreed. "But we have time." "She'll need to recover. Her magic was broken. It won't be easy for her to return to full strength." Arthur stopped at the window, gazing out over the rolling hills and forests that surrounded Camelot. "I've never wanted this," he said quietly. "I never wanted war with her. She was family once, Merlin." "She made her choices," Merlin replied. "And so did we." "You can't blame yourself for what she's become." Arthur's jaw tightened. "But I do." In the wilderness, Morgana's strength was slowly returning. Her search for greater power had begun. The old, forgotten pathways of magic whispered to her in the dark, guiding her deeper into realms long lost to time. She had heard stories of an ancient sorcerer Tharoga whose name was once feared across the land. He had been exiled, or so the tales went, his power sealed away in the farthest reaches of the world. But Morgana knew better. She had sensed Ida the lingering trace of his magic, faint but unmistakable. Tharog would be her key to vengeance. The journey to find him was treacherous. Morgana's magic, though growing stronger, wasn't enough to protect her fully from the dangers of the cursed lands she now traversed. Shadows slithered between the trees, creatures with eyes that glowed like embers stalked her through the night, but she was undeterred. Each step forward was a step closer to revenge. She could feel Tharog's presence like a beacon in the distance, pulling her toward him. Finally, after days of travel, she found herself standing before a towering, crumbling fortress half sunken into the earth. Dark tendrils of magic coiled around it, ancient and vile. This was the place. The air was thick with a stench of decay, but Morgana breathed it in as if it were the sweetest perfume. She raised her hands, muttering the incantation that would break the barrier between her and the sorcerer within. The ground trembled as the magic responded to her call. A low, guttural voice echoed through the fortress. "Who dares to disturb my slumber?" Morgana stepped forward, her voice steady. "It is I, Morgana of Camelot. I seek an alliance." For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a deafening crash, the doors of the fortress swung open, revealing the dark figure of Tharog standing in the shadows. His eyes glowed a sickly green, and his face, though worn with age, still radiated power. He studied her, and she could feel his magic probing her defenses, testing her resolve. "You seek power," he said, his voice like the hiss of a serpent. "I seek vengeance," Morgana corrected. Tharog's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Vengeance is a form of power." "And what makes you think I will help you?" "Because we have a common enemy," Morgana said, stepping closer. "Arthur of Camelot." "He banished you, didn't he?" "Just as he has wronged me." "Together, we can bring him to his knees." Tharog's eyes narrowed. He was silent for a long time, weighing her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well, Morgana of Camelot. We shall see if your hatred burns as fiercely as mine." Weeks passed in Camelot. The uneasy peace lingered, but beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Arthur had strengthened the castle's defenses, doubled the patrols, and consulted with Merlin almost daily, but nothing could shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. It was Merlin who first sensed the disturbance. He had been studying an ancient tome in his chambers when the air around him seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself were bending. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he was somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark. He saw flashes of Morgana, her face twisted with fury, and beside her stood Tharog, his hands crackling with dark energy. Merlin snapped back to the present, his heart pounding. He had seen enough. Tharog was alive, and Morgana had found him. He rushed to Arthur's chambers, his mind racing. They needed to act fast, before Morgana could gather her strength. But when he burst through the door, he found Arthur sitting at his desk, head bowed, his expression grim. "You've seen it too," Arthur said, without looking up. Merlin nodded. "Tharog, he's with her." Arthur exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Then it's worse than we thought." "We need allies," Merlin said. "More than we have now. I've been thinking a broken bar. There are forces beyond this realm that could tip the balance in our favor. I can reach out to them, but it's dangerous." Arthur looked up, his eyes hard. "Do it." "Whatever it takes to stop them," Merlin nodded, though his heart was heavy. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but they had no choice. If Morgana and Tharog were allowed to continue, Camelot would be doomed. He gathered his staff and set off on his journey, his destination the Isle of Avalon, where the ancient powers of magic still lingered. Deep within Tharog's fortress, Morgana and the Dark Sorcerer were preparing for war. Tharog had opened the ancient tomes of forbidden magic, and together they crafted spells that would decimate Camelot's defenses. Morgana's power had grown, her connection to the dark arts now stronger than ever. She could feel the energy pulsing through her veins, hot and wild, ready to be unleashed. "The time is almost upon us," Tharog said, his voice a low rumble. "Are you ready, Morgana?" Morgana turned to him, her eyes glowing with the same sickly green light that radiated from Tharog's. "More than ready." She could feel the storm building, the darkness swelling within her. Soon, she would have her revenge, and Arthur and Merlin would pay for everything they had done. The days stretched on as Merlin journeyed toward Avalon, the weight of what he had to do growing heavier with each passing mile. He knew the price of calling upon the ancient powers of Avalon. A magic like that always came with a cost. But this was no longer about simple spells or fortifications, it was about the survival of Camelot itself. Morgana and Tharog's combined strength was a threat unlike any other, and only by reaching deep into the fabric of magic itself could he hope to counter it. As he neared the shores of the Enchanted Isle, the mist thickened around him, swirling like the whispers of forgotten spirits. The Lady of the Lake had foreseen his arrival, and her ethereal form emerged from the waters as Merlin stepped onto the island. "You seek aid, Merlin," she said, her voice soft yet resonating with ancient power. "But the path you are walking is dangerous. Once you call upon the forces that slumber here, there will be no turning back." Merlin's eyes met hers, resolute. "If I do nothing, Camelot will fall. Arthur and his kingdom will be lost. I have no choice." The lady studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Very well," she said finally, gliding closer. "But know Thesa, whatever you gain here, you will lose something else. Magic is a balance, and the scales will tip. Are you prepared to pay the price?" Merlin nodded. "I am." With a graceful wave of her hand, the lady beckoned the waters to part, revealing a hidden stone altar. Upon it lay an ancient artifact, a shard of crystal, glowing faintly with the light of the old magic, the very magic that had shaped the world. It was a relic of a time before even the great kingdoms of men, and its power was immeasurable. Merlin approached it with reverence, his hand hovering over the crystal. He could feel its hum, like the pulse of the universe itself. This was the weapon he needed, the only thing that could stand against Tharog's dark sorcery. Without hesitation, he grasped the shard, and the power surged through him, filling his veins with an otherworldly energy that threatened to consume him. The lady watched in silence as Merlin struggled to contain the force within him, his body trembling with the effort. "Remember, Merlin," she said softly, "the price will be steep." Merlin's breath came in ragged gasps as he finally steadied himself, the crystal's power now intertwined with his own. He had what he came for, but what he would lose, he had yet to discover. Back at Camelot, the air grew thick with anticipation. Arthur stood at the castle's battlements, watching the horizon for any sign of Merlin's return. His knights had been preparing for war, their armor gleaming in the torchlight, but Arthur knew that steel alone would not be enough to face what was coming. Morgana's magic was a threat unlike any they had faced before, and without Merlin's intervention, they would be fighting a losing battle. Just as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a cold wind swept across the fields, and a shadow seemed to ripple over the landscape. Arthur's heart sank as he realized what it meant. Morgana was coming. The warning bells rang out across Camelot, and the knights sprang into action, gathering at the gates as the dark magic began to press in from all sides. Arthur's hand tightened on the hilt of Excalibur, the weight of the legendary blade grounding him as he prepared for the onslaught. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and from the darkness emerged an army of twisted, nightmarish creaturesque creations of Tharog's vile sorcery. Their forms were grotesque, twisted mockeries of life, with claws that scraped the earth and eyes that glowed with malice. Leading them, her figure wreathed in shadow, was Morgana. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he saw her. This was not the sister he once knew. Her power had grown beyond recognition, her very presence crackling with dark energy. And beside her, standing tall and terrible, was Tharog, his skeletal figure looming like a deathly shadow. "Arthur!" Morgana's voice echoed across the battlefield, dripping with venom. "You will pay for what you did to me. Camelot will burn, and your legacy will crumble to dust." Arthur stepped forward, Excalibur gleaming in his hand. "Morgana, it's not too late. You don't have to do this. We were once family. We can still a family." Morgana's laughter was harsh, like the crack of a whip. "You abandoned me. You and Merlin both. You let me fall into darkness, and now I will drag you down with me." There was no reasoning with her. Arthur knew that now, she was lost to the dark magic that consumed her, her heart twisted beyond redemption. His grip tightened on his sword, and with a nod to his knights, he signaled the attack. The battle was ferocious. Morgana's creatures tore through the ranks of Camelot's knights, their claws and teeth ripping through steel and flesh. Arthur fought with all the strength he had, Excalibur cleaving through the dark beings with a brilliance that lit up the night. But for every creature they felled, more seemed to take their place. Above the chaos, Merlin appeared, his figure crackling with the power of the crystal shard. The moment he arrived, he could feel Tharog's gaze locking onto him, the ancient sorcerer's dark magic surging toward him in a wave. Merlin raised his staff, the crystal glowing brighter as he summoned a shield of light to repel the attack. The magical battle between Merlin and Tharog was unlike anything the battlefield had ever seen. Lightning crackled through the air, and waves of raw energy clashed, sending shock waves rippling through the ground. Every time Tharog unleashed his dark magic, Merlin countered with the power of the crystal. The two forces locked in a deadly stalemate. But Merlin could feel the strain. The crystal's power was immense, but it was also volatile, and the more he used it, the more it began to slip out of his control. He could sense the balance tipping, the cost of his actions looming ever closer. As the battle raged on, Arthur found himself face to face with Morgana. Her eyes burned with hatred as she raised her hands, summoning a torrent of dark fire that shot toward him. Arthur barely had time to raise his sword, the magic colliding with Excalibur in a burst of light. "You can't win, Morgana," Arthur shouted over the roar of the flames. "This isn't who you are." Morgana's face twisted into a snarl. "I am exactly who I was always meant to be." With a cry, she unleashed another wave of magic, but this time Arthur was ready. He lunged forward, Excalibur cutting through the dark energy and striking Morgana's staff. The force of the blow sent a shock wave through the air, and Morgana stumbled back, her magic faltering for a brief moment. But that moment was all Arthur needed. He pressed the attack, forcing Morgana to retreat, their battle raging across the battlefield as knights and monsters clashed around them. In the distance, Merlin and Tharog's battle reached its peak. Merlin, his body trembling with the effort of controlling the crystal's power, knew he had only one chance. He raised his staff high, channeling every ounce of magic he had left into a final, desperate spell. The crystal flared with light, and with a deafening crack, it shattered, sending a wave of pure, unfiltered energy surging through the battlefield. Tharog screamed as the magic tore through him, his body disintegrating into ash as the dark sorcery that fueled him was obliterated. The creatures he had summoned vanished into nothingness, and the battlefield fell silent. Morgana, weakened by Tharog's defeat, collapsed to her knees, her dark magic fading as the last remnants of her power slipped away. Arthur stood over her, Excalibur still in hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Morgana looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of anger and sorrow. "You a broken bar, you could have stopped this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur lowered his sword, his heart heavy. "I know," he said quietly. "But now a broken bar, it's over." Merlin approached, his face pale and drawn. He had paid the price for the crystal's power. His magic was all but gone, the once great wizard now little more than a shadow of himself. Arthur looked down at Morgana, his emotions swirling in turmoil. "Take her to the dungeons," he ordered his knights, though his voice was filled with sadness. As Morgana was led away, Arthur and Merlin stood in the ruins of the battlefield, the weight of their victory pressing down on them. Camelot had been saved, but at what cost?